And so I'm okay with recording if you want to start it. Yeah, so it's recording.
Yeah, I just, that was Mamadi said that. I need so much help here, and these students are so solicitous. Use that big word, but they're
That's
so
great.
helpful. Yeah.
So once I got in the door at these places, I did more and more of the kind of stories that were of interest to me. And over time, I got to move into the areas that I was most comfortable with. As a business reporter for 6 years as a business reporter for 6 years at Newsweek, 7 years at Newsweek, I gravitated toward, again, technology, science, the sort of stuff that I could write about, that pursued my interest, in some legal stuff. Then when I put my hand up for jobs at other publications, I was able to stress the things that I like to do and could show work that I had done well. And so that's how I ended up doing those things. When you start out, you don't get to choose everything you do, but over time you can work your way toward the things that most resonate with you. The Mo Ramo piece, in the Mo Ramo piece, Diana asked why I put background information about her life in the middle of the article. And my answer there is pretty simple. It felt right. The fact is that when you do an article like this, that's a profile, but is also talking about the institution that she works at, and also describes the issues that she'll be dealing with as head of the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, that you want to find out about her, you want to tell about her past, but it wouldn't have felt right to start off by talking about her personal life at the very beginning. You've really got to set the stage for what you're going to be saying, and find the best way to draw people in, and then give them more and more information, sort of bouncing from one theme to the next. When I wrote the piece, for the longest time while I was working on it, I thought I might open with her father having made a beautiful comic book for her, with her as going around with Jacques Cousteau, because that's a nice anecdotal lead. That says, look at what this person has been through. Look at how her childhood led her to this. But there are 100 ways to start any story, and there are 100 ways to structure it. And as you write, you'll often find yourself sort of juggling top down to the bottom, middle up, down, until you find the outline that feels right. It's for people who have the time to structure an outline. I do a rough outline as I'm writing, and generally just, here are the themes and how I see them unfolding of any story, and here are the incidents I want to work in. But then once I've written out that sketched out outline and filled it in, I move stuff around all the time. Matthew asks, what continues to motivate you to write more pieces even after having written so much? You said so many great pieces, but why keep writing? And thank you for the compliment. Really, the one reason to keep writing is that if they keep paying me to do it, and I can't say I'm very good at anything else. I'm terrible at home handiwork. I couldn't make a living in carpentry. I've got a law degree, but I know good lawyers, and I think I would not be a good lawyer. So this is something I actually do well, and so I continue to do it, and I still get a charge out of it. I still enjoy when the structure of a story comes together. I still like when that thought comes to me that'll make a phrase pop, that'll make a sentence better, that might cause someone to be surprised while they're reading along, or even laugh out loud. Matthew also asked, do writing ideas come to me randomly, or are they built up topics you've been meaning to write about? And it's a little of both. I have a list of stories that I keep on a electronic sticky note on my computer, and I go back and add to the list, delete from the list, and knock stuff out as I write them. Whether it's my ideas or an editor saying I'd really like to see this, or a news event or a study coming up that just has to be written about, so that there's always plenty to do. I have questions here from Precious. Why did you decide to write about climate change? And that again is less about inspiration than occupation. That an editor at the paper came to me while I was on the national desk and asked if I'd like to go to the science desk and write about climate change. And I'd written some stories about climate change as a reporter focusing on the environment on the national desk, but the idea of writing about it full time really appealed to me. I mean, it is just about the most important issue facing the planet right now. Though there are lots of things that happen all the time and are extremely important. You know, the pandemic is an incredibly important story, an incredibly important crisis around the world. But once we vaccinate people against the coronavirus, we're still going to have climate change, and we're still not doing enough to deal with it. And so that's what made me say yes 6 years ago when this editor said, would you like to come write about climate change? And I haven't thought about going anywhere else since, just because it's as interesting as anything I've ever written about.
So John,
Uh,
sorry for interrupting, but
no.
very early in the semester, they read the story that you wrote about the Capitol protesters and and you interviewed people who were climate activists who talked about how they were treated in demonstrations very badly. And they noticed that the white racist lunatics were not being treated very badly. And I wrote to you and I said, why did you write it? Could you share with the class what you told me? Because it reminds me of what you're talking about.
Well, in that case, you had this terrible thing happen in Washington at the Capitol, and I woke up the next morning, and an editor said, "Do you think there's a story in the fact that these people got such light treatment during the riots, that compared to what happened to people at Black Lives Matter protests, compared to what's happened to people at environmental protests around the world? Um, is there a story there?" And I did what I do when an editor asks me something, which is to say, I'm going to make 3 phone calls and I'll call you back. And within an hour, I saw that, yes, there's a great story to be done. And of course, something emerged that I wasn't expecting. Bill McKibben, who's one of the great climate campaigners, said, well, we come from the tradition of civil disobedience, and we're talking about Bill and I are talking about the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., and Bill and I are talking about Mahatma Gandhi, and we have a really good conversation about what protesters expect and how protests work, and the fact that, yes, the police held back in this protest in a way that that a lot of other people would haven't seen. Especially one of the activists, environmental justice and climate activist named Rev Yearwood, who is African American. He said, "Look, I've been beaten up at protests. The cops just beat me up. Once I got my arm broken. This is extremely gentle treatment." And of course, now the FBI has recorded all this and are arresting people. But it seemed to me a good way to look at that disparity between the types of protest and who gets what. And sure enough, it made sense as a story. And I had the thing written in about 3 hours, and we put it up online and in the paper the next day. So a lot of this stuff just comes out of the moment, that you'll talk it out with an editor and say, we ought to do that. And a couple hours later, you're done. That's a large part of the work that I do. Also, the question here is, since John Trimble was your teacher, how did he shape your writing? And it's by his example. If you go through the book, you see phrases that really can stay with you for a lifetime. He made me think very hard about who my audience is and who I'm writing for. And his emphasis on rewriting was very important for telling me, go back over things. But the thing that stays with me the longest are some of the phrases that made the book fun to read, like when something is MA, merely adequate. I hear him saying, that right there, when I'm looking over a piece after when I'm about to turn it in, that's merely adequate. You might be able to say this in a more interesting way. You might be able to say that more forcefully. You might be able to say that without using a passive voice. And so I sort of hear John pushing me to do a better job as I work through pieces. Aqua asks, how do you pace yourself so that you're able to write well and in a timely manner? And as I said with the piece about protests, sometimes you don't have time to pace yourself in a timely manner. You just get down, do the reporting, grab the quotes, and fill in around them, and you've got a story, and that happens in a couple of hours. But for longer term projects, especially books, you just have to make sure you're making the time. I do a lot of the work I do on books on the weekends and late at night when everybody's gone to bed. It's peaceful time, and I can sort of break it down into chunks that I know I'll be able to do in a certain amount of time. A lot of this is the experience of knowing what it's going to take to do something. And once you've written thousands of stories, you've got a pretty good sense of how long it's going to take you to write 3,000 words and what you need to be able to do that, and to recognize what you haven't found yet so that you can go out and report it out and get that information that is missing. It's not automatic, but it's easier than it was when I was just starting out. And then Aqua also asked, what inspired me to write Oddly Normal? The fact is, when you go through a really powerful experience, if you're a writer, you generally want to tell people about it, especially if you think it's the kind of experience that you can share with others in a way that they might benefit from it. That there might, my wife and I thought there might be other parents who are looking to support their kids and don't really know how, and who are dealing with issues of depression and these other things that we encountered. And we just thought that it was at the time of the It Gets Better videos. The It Gets Better videos were, for teenagers, and it was people saying, I'm gay and I had a really hard time when I was your age, and I thought things would not get better, and they do get better. And so the tagline in a lot of those videos was "It Gets Better," and those were everywhere. I mean, Barack Obama recorded an "It Gets Better" video, and many employees of Apple recorded "It Gets Better" videos, and so it became a big wave. And so for me, the idea was that this could be something like an "It Gets Better" story for parents, because we felt we came through it on the other side doing pretty well, feeling pretty good about how things worked out. I've got Riley. I hope I'm pronouncing everyone's names right, and I apologize if I'm not.
No, you're pronouncing everybody's names wrong.
Okay. Well, okay, Miss. Well, Mr. Strauss, I'm sorry about that. You could have handed me pronouncers.
No, I just could listen. But the person who you called Akua or whatever, her name's Aquia. But how would you know that?
Okay. Well, if we were meeting face to face, I would ask first.
I know.
Which is, so do you have others edit your writing pieces before finalizing them? Yes, I work at a newspaper. Everything goes through 2 editors before it reaches print. And when I try to write things on my own, I have typographical errors and all sorts of other things. I'm human, and my own. If you want to see how bad I am, read my tweets. I have lots of typographical errors in my tweets, and things where I've rewritten a phrase but not changed the beginning so that there's no subject verb agreement. I mean, I'm terrible. So editors are very important to me. Also asks, do you ever experience writer's block? And if you do, what are some good tips to get out of writer's block? And this is going to sound maybe arrogant, but I don't have time for writer's block. I have a job. My job is to write. And if I can't write, then I shouldn't be a writer. And so while I sometimes have a hard time starting, I've got lots of ways to get me over the hump, but I can't just not write. The main thing I do is to start the story in the middle. If I've got a paragraph that I can already sort of sketch out, that I already know what's going to make sense, and I haven't figured out how to start it yet, I start in the middle. I might start at the end, and then I stitch it together when I'm done. But the idea is just write. Find something that you're close enough to write to start pounding on. Charlene asks, on average, how long did it take you to find reputable sources for each article? And of course, as a science writer, if I'm writing about a study, I have the authors of the study, and their status as reputable people is at least partly established by the fact that they've got a paper coming out in a reputable, peer-reviewed scientific journal. So what they're saying has already gotten the attention of a portion of the scientific community. And then I'll always ask them, who disagrees with you about the point you're making in this piece? You've said you've delivered your theory here, but there's surely people who really disagree with your research here. Who should I call who will give me another view? And people are always happy to deliver me to their enemies. You know, they all know that in science it's an ongoing argument. There are things we know and things that have not yet been established. And the things that have not yet been established, any honest scientist wants you to go through the points of the debate. And so I get many good sources that way. Along with that, of course, there are lots of that you can always go to the clips. You can read. It's especially easy now that there's Google. You can read the various other things that have been written about this topic. Who has commented on this topic? Beyond that, I'm always looking to diversify my source list. It's really important to me to make sure that I'm not just falling into the habit, which is especially easy in the sciences, of just quoting a bunch of white guys. There's plenty of white guys in the world, and they've all got something to say. They've got something to say about this topic, but the fields themselves are much more diverse. And so I look to talk to more people. I look to go to websites like 500 Women in Science and diverse sources to find people who are not among necessarily the usual suspects for a story like this, but who can provide insight, and by having them in the story, have the story look a little more like America than the faculty lounge at their institution. Beyond that, too, finding diverse sources is good for the diversity of opinion it brings in. There are people who surprise me with what they say. A good interview always surprises me, and I keep a Rolodex, if I can use that word, a source list that's always expanding, but I'm always trying to build it in these ways. It's also just important to choose topics to write about that bring you into the lives of real people. That within climate and environmental journalism, there's the field of environmental justice, the fact that the burdens of environmental degradation fall unevenly on the shoulders of people living in poor and vulnerable communities of color. If you live in Lake Charles, Louisiana, and a storm comes in, hurricane, and a fire starts at a petrochemical plant or a chemical manufacturing plant, who lives closest to that plant? Well, it's largely going to be minority neighborhoods at what they call the fence line. They call them fence line communities. And those people deal with a greater share of pollution and take on, and experience more risk. So it feels to me, you always look for the stories. When I wrote about the storm, I wanted to write about the environmental justice issues that show up in hurricanes. And that's what the Becerra piece was about as well. When I talk about Javier Becerra, he's really tried to infuse his office with an environmental justice perspective and getting involved in local disputes that can take the burden of pollution off of the people who do the least to cause it and who suffer from it the most. I mean, it doesn't, as Dr. Robert Bullard said in the Louisiana story, said, I'm not saying white people don't suffer in a hurricane. Of course they do. I'm just saying that the likelihood that you're going to have more problems in these communities is high. And so, so that was an important, that's an important thing. And it's not just looking for the sources, it's looking for an array of sources, and it's looking for topics that will bring you to a broader group of people to talk to. And then I've got Miranda here asking, how do you know you'd be able to do the one sentence paragraphs and they are productive? And the answer is that again, intuition is a big part of how you write. And one of the things you want to do is not have a deadening series of sentences all of the same length. That a good story has rhythm, and you want to mix it up in ways that keep people surprised by the rhythm and keep them reading. I have problems with people who overdo the one sentence punchy paragraph. It's when you read 5,000 words of Robert Caro's, 5,000 pages of Robert Caro's Lyndon Johnson biography, you get pretty tired of the super long paragraph and then the one sentence paragraph that punches it. It starts to feel more like a gimmick. But as a writer, you're both using the gimmicks and trying to make sure that you're not using them so much that they look like gimmicks. And part of the writing process is just making sure that you keep it fresh enough without the artifice of that overwhelming the writing. I don't write unconsciously, but I try not to plan so much that it starts to look like I'm just following a pattern.
Okay, and by the way, since you mentioned Miranda, I see she has a chat there, and you didn't say this, but you would welcome any students being like me to just say, I have a question right now.
Yes, of course.
But Miranda wrote, when did you start your journey of writing?
I see that now, and I guess that you could say I started it when I was in 6th grade. I was in 6th grade, and I volunteered to write a one-page newspaper for my 6th grade class, and it is called the Hensley Herald. And I wrote most of it, and then I had other kids write a little bit of it. I think I don't know why I got that idea, except that I always liked newspapers, and I typed it up on a typewriter in my mom's home office. And I think that was the beginning for me. I think that there were other times when I wrote. In my high school, we had a high school newspaper, and it had fallen. It had just died. There weren't enough volunteers to keep it going, and there were some kids who thought maybe they'd like to bring back the newspaper, and so I participated in that and wrote for it. So that was a lot of what we were doing. I just found myself again and again. I found myself writing again and again. I found myself sort of putting myself into the position of trying to write for people, and but I didn't think I was going to be a writer. I didn't think I was going to write for a living until I was in my mid-20s and realized that I could make a living in it. And then I started doing that. But But the fact is, I was always writing.
Yeah, John, since you brought that up too, because my students are generally interested in like what they want to do for, the rest of their lives, and when the pandemic ends in 2029, they want to go out there and look for jobs. So can you just explain the relationship of you being a lawyer to you being a journalist and the career choice? I think they'd be interested.
Well, I was in law school. I didn't know that I was going to be a journalist. I was in law school. I got a job while I was in law school at the school newspaper, and I really just loved it. It was exciting and fun, and seemed more fun to me than being a lawyer was going to be, frankly. And I was going along doing that, and it sort of came up to a point where I needed to decide whether I was going to ever try to be a writer. I finished up my year as editor of the school newspaper, and I talked to my girlfriend, now my wife. I talked to her and I said, I'd really like to try to be a journalist, but I don't know if I'm going to make it. If you think it's okay, I'd like to try. And if I don't have a real job at the end of 5 years, if I don't have a real job with like a dental plan, then I'll be a lawyer, and I'll do that because I was finishing law school anyway. And she said that was okay, so I took a chance. And within 2 years, I was working at Newsweek in New York, and I didn't have to look back. So that worked out pretty well. That worked out very well. I've got Brian here asking, how can I improve my writing skills? And my answer to that is always to write. To write. Every time you write, you can learn from your writing. You can see the things that don't sound right to you. You can revise everything you write. I believe helps make you a better writer as long as you focus and try to figure out, could this be better? How does this compare to other pieces of writing that I've seen? Alex DeMartino, Alex says, what made you want to become a writer? And as I was just saying, I kept writing. I kept finding myself in a position of working at the school newspaper, starting this newspaper, working at that job that was about writing. And finally, in my mid-20s, I looked back and realized that I'd always been writing, that I'd always loved it. And so I just made a decision to keep doing it, to keep on with it. And it was the thing that I was best at. It was the thing that gave me the most satisfaction to do. Alex has also asked, how was the experience of writing about your son? And I'll say that it's sort of nerve-wracking. You're writing about another person, one of the closest people to you. I talked to Joe before I wrote that book, and whenever I write about my kids, I talk to them, ask them first. When I've written personal pieces about my older son, Sam, I said, I'm thinking of doing this. Is that okay? Sometimes those pieces were very personal, but I felt that I had something to say, and so I would bring it up. I wrote about Sam and his college part-time job, which was being a nude art model. And Sam had told some funny stories about it when he came home. And I thought, that's a story. I could write that. And I wrote it for the education life section of the Times, because it was about both about supporting yourself in college, and earning your lunch money, but also it was about overcoming embarrassment and just the weird life of being a nude art model, which he had very funny stories about. So, but I wouldn't have done it without asking him first. That's what you do. And so that's been, those stories are some of my favorites, because ultimately you're sharing the story that you've had between you with other people. Miller asks, what do you do when you get overwhelmed by your work? And again, same as with writer's block, I don't really have much of the opportunity to get overwhelmed, but when I feel that way, I take a nap. I take a walk, I take a nap, I take a run, anything that clears my head. because I know that when I get back to my desk, that piece is still going to be there and needs to be written. But you try to pace yourself, and you try to keep a calm approach to things. Jasper asks, what is your best advice for a college student in a writing class? And again, to get back to that idea, it's to write. It's to knock something out. If you're having trouble writing, write something badly and then go back and fix it, just so that you get started. And Jasper also asks, where do you get the information for your writing pieces? And of course, as I read studies all the time. I do research. I read what other people are writing. I read books, and I talk to people about what I've read. And that not only gives me story ideas, it helps me through the stories that I'm trying to write. Jessica asked me, do I attempt to be original or to convey to readers what they want? I don't think that's a very helpful distinction. I don't think that that is a distinction that really makes sense for me, because let's talk about climate change for a second. It's not me trying to write an original piece, although I need to write something that I need to find things that haven't been written to death. But nobody wants to hear that the planet's in trouble. But I need to write the story. I need to get the story right. I need to convey the information with accuracy and some urgency. On the other hand, and tell the story clearly and without error. So it's not necessarily what the people want to hear, but my obligation is to tell them what they ought to know, and to do that as clearly as possible, so nobody gets stopped 2 paragraphs in and says, I'm not going to read this. And Jessica also asked, how did the first book change my process of composing? And it just meant that I was working on books now. It just meant that I love the idea of long-term projects. I love books as an alternative to the daily process of journalism, because you get to plan, you get to think, you get to spend the time on really shaping and outlining and building something bigger than one of these stories that takes me 2 hours to write. So having the experience of writing a full-length book, and I've done 4 of them now, having that experience just gives me a counterbalance to the daily hurry up, and lets me, even if I'm on a tight deadline, it lets me think hard about what I'm doing, and then to completely read the book again when it's done and find ways to connect all the parts. Madison says, I find it so interesting that John Schwartz starts every piece with an anecdote and then gets to the main part of the essay. If that's what you took away from my writing, then I opened too many stories with anecdotes.
Well, they only read, no, John, she's only talking about the ones they read. So don't.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm worried.
Yeah.
You went farther and said, God, he only starts with anecdotes. What's wrong with Schwartz? It's one way to start a story. There are lots and lots of ways to start stories, but anecdotes are, and my editors will warn against overusing the anecdotal lead, that starting every story with an anecdote. As they say, you don't want to just inundate people with someone they've never heard of over and over and over again. But I think that anecdotes are a great way to introduce a story that's going to be about individuals and their struggles, individuals and what they're up against. And of course, it's a great way to start a profile of someone like Maureen Ramo. But the idea is that you find the way to start that best gets you into the material, and that might change. I might come up with 3 different ways to start a story as I get started, and then only at the very end do I decide, okay, this is how I'm going to start this.
But just to reiterate, you don't always start writing at the beginning of the story. The beginning might come later.
And that might be the last thing I do. Sometimes it is.
Yeah. That's an issue. A lot of students say, "Oh, I don't know how to get started," and I just start writing anything, And
just start in the middle, something that you've already thought about a little bit, and you can get there. And then Maeva asked, do you find writing for some purposes more difficult than writing for other purposes? It's, that it's great to have a gripping story about with a central person who is a really great talker. But there are lots of things you do that are very process oriented. They're important because the event is is important, but it might not be very interesting. And that's like eating your spinach. Sometimes you've just got to do those things. So on Friday, I did a story about about the issuance of an environmental impact statement on a major infrastructure project in southern Louisiana. And the event itself was, one step it's a major step in a long chain of things that might get this infrastructure project started to be built next year. But it was a big enough moment in the story for me to want to write about it. And then construction is going to take 5 years. So it could feel endless, and it could feel like there's never a time to step into this thing. And so it could have been a boring story. It could have been one that I'd be reluctant, be bored about writing. But the process itself, the project itself, which is a $1.4 billion cut in the banks of the Mississippi River to let a controlled amount of river water into the estuaries and bios of Barataria Bay to rebuild land. It's just fascinating to me. It's endlessly fascinating to me. The idea that we can do these big projects and try to correct some of the problems we've created in the world, and that in trying to correct those problems, we are likely to cause other problems as well, including doing damage to the wild dolphins that live around there. So to me, it was any story could be boring when you think about it, and this one could have been one that I would dread to write. But in fact, I found a way in that was interesting to me, and I got it done. And I actually wrote until 2 a.m. on it because they released it a little early, and I had to just get the thing done. But to me, it was fun. I mean, one of the things about being a science writer is that some of the stuff you write about is going to seem dull to some people, but I'm interested in them, and so I try to make them as interesting as possible. I think that is all of the questions that I had in front of me from this class, but if anybody else has any questions you want to bring up, just pop it into the chat or I can, or we can say bye, either way.
Oh, no. Go ahead, Mama D.
Oh, okay. If any, is there like anything that you don't like about writing or like your writing process?
Yeah, I mean, the process of writing, actually sitting down and writing can be sort of a grind. I mean, sometimes you get into this sense of flow and there's a real satisfaction in it. But for the most part, just sitting down to write is not fun. But which is, I mean, I don't know anybody who absolutely loves every aspect of his job, and writing is my job. The process of writing is just sometimes it's grinding it out sentence by sentence, but I like the result. I like being done.
Could you talk a little bit about writers that you would recommend? I just was going to say you'll recognize this.
I
never heard of this person.
Oh, The City We Became, Jemison.
Right. And I read the opening to my students, and it's like, I sing the city, fucking city. I stand on the rooftop of a building. So you like reading this kind of very depraved, deranged writing? You don't just read.
I like reading everything. I mean,
Right.
in terms of, I found that the Jemison book was wonderful. It was, it's wild, and it has a great, New York City feel to it. It's not, she's better known for she's better known for other works. This is one of her more recent ones, but she's better known for really complex and literary works like The Fifth Season, which is a terrific book. But this one was just wild and fun. But I read audiobooks. I listen to audiobooks, and I run for about an hour every morning. And so I get through a lot of books, and I'm just looking at my, I just finished and nonfiction and fiction. So I just finished Slavery by Another Name by Doug Blackman, and it's an amazing, amazing history of the types of slavery that persisted after the end of the Civil War. That yes, the 13th Amendment ended slavery as a practice, but there were still thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were caught in a system that where they would get accused of crimes that were not, some just completely made up, and some meaningless, like vagrancy, which were applied far more commonly to blacks than whites. And then you would be brought before a JP, and you would be assessed a fine, and you would be told that this nice person over here was going to pay your fine. And then you would work it off with that nice person, and that person would take you to his farm or his lumber mill or his turpentine forest, where they would get pine sap out of pines and then boil it down into turpentine, or coal mines all over Alabama. And you would be chained and beaten and even killed. And I think we all know that slavery was terrible, but the post-slavery years had slavery too. And I knew that there was some bad stuff that went on, but a book like this really lays out just how terrible, just how extensive it was. And so, and I heard about that book recently, and I picked it up, and it's a shattering experience to read. It's an amazing book to read. Mm-hmm. And but I also just finished a David Sedaris book, Calypso. And I like the works of Haruki Murakami because he makes me go into a sort of a dream state. But so that balance between novels that delight me and nonfiction that I really need to read to understand what they didn't teach me in school is really important to me.
Okay, and Ian has a chat there. Can you see his chat about advice?
What advice do you have for someone interested in going into journalism? Well, it's a hard field to break into now because journalism at newspapers is shrinking, and there are far fewer jobs than there used to be at newspapers. But there's a pretty rich journalism ecosystem out there that's growing with a lot of these nonprofit organizations and self-funded things like Substack, where if you start doing reporting, you can get people to sign up to read your stuff. So there's a lot more going on than there used to be. My advice is that I don't know much about internships, but I do know that the way to write is to write. And so you start thinking about things that might be stories. You figure out how you could write that story, what you could bring to it. And then you approach one of these publications, whether it's, maybe not the New York Times right off, but a local publication or a community website or if it's an environmental story, for instance, there's all these new things that are out there that weren't there 10 years, 20 years ago. Inside Climate News and lots of climate newsletters that you can start writing for, and it can get your name out. This is what I did back in the days when everything was in print. That I wasn't going to get a job in a newspaper because I didn't have any reason for anybody to hire me. But I started freelancing for the small publications that were out there at the time. The Austin Chronicle, Third Coast Magazine, things that nobody really knows about now, except the Austin Chronicle is still going. in, finding these smaller places, getting my stuff published in them, and then being able to show them to other people that I might pitch my stories to. And there's an element of hustle to it, but because there's not as many established institutions as there used to be. But in the 2 years it took me to get my first job at Newsweek, when I'd been, after being daily text and editor and doing all that and just doing freelance, I just did a lot of freelance all the time for people who could barely pay me, and use those clips to show when I would pitch to bigger organizations. Sort of built my way up. But the most important thing you can do is read what's out there, and then approach those publications that you like and say, I've got a piece I'd like to do for you, and here it is. Here's my 1-page pitch, and see if you can't start writing for some of these publications. That would be my way to start today. It's different from it's a little different from the way I started, but really there are a lot of similarities, because there wasn't a job for me for years once I started in journalism, but I did enough freelance to show people that I could write, and then was able to apply to Newsweek after a few years. And even then, I didn't apply to Newsweek. I applied to Newsweek on Campus, which was a little side thing that they were doing, a little side operation that focused on college journalism and college students. And I did that. I started freelancing for them, and then I got a job with them. And then after a year with them, that's when I got to the main Newsweek, and that editor said, read a book.
Okay, very good. Anybody have any other questions for John?
I have a question. Do you think using figurative language and like word devices like that, do you think that strengthens writing?
Using what kind of words?
Like figurative language.
Oh, well, there are times when you want your language to be nearly poetic and deeply descriptive. And sometimes you just want to give your reader a straight shot of the facts. It's tied really intimately to the subject and what you're trying to do with the piece. There are some times when you just need to get a piece out as simply and in as straightforward a manner as you can, and there's no room to play. But other times you can get quite descriptive, really put people in the place. When I wrote about visiting with a guy who was rebuilding his own wetland in about 80 acres that he had bought for nothing in South Louisiana, the whole thing was to describe the sweaty hard work that he did as his hobby and how satisfying it was for him, and then sort of leading you up at the end to describing the scene, describing the spiders, describing the spider webs you would walk into. But then at the end he just sort of said, I put at the end the fact that he said that that after his deployments to Iraq, a lot of things didn't make sense to him anymore, but being in nature made sense to him. And the fact that this was where he healed, that was a story that required a very descriptive and lyrical approach. But I wouldn't do that on just on every story. I realized that I needed to convey that there.
Yeah. Now, I hate to end this, but my students have lives here, unlike us, John. So it's 11:20, so the class is actually ending. But
Okay.
yeah, this was great. And for the next class, I'm going to figure out this Zoom thing beforehand. But I'm very, very grateful, obviously, that you came to the class, and I'm sure my students are going to have a lot to say about it on Thursday when we meet.
Well, I hope I wasn't too boring. Thanks, guys.
Thank you for talking to us.
Thank
You bet.
Thank
John,
you.
is
I
there?
learned a lot.
Thank you.
Oh, wow. Okay. John, is there a time I need to be back with you? What time?
Well, the next class, I'm saying 11:45, but I'm gonna see how did I end up actually what got you into this class? Because everybody was giving me great advice. What was the magic thing I had to send you?
You texted me the ID for the meeting. I used the ID and then you texted me the password. That's what I did.
Okay, so I'll text you the ID and the password for the next one.
Yep. Yep.
All right.
All right.
So now I'm learning. Aren't these students great? I mean, I love these
They're
guys.
fantastic. This is a great group of guys. Thank you so much.
All right.
Have a
So I'll
great
see you guys
day.
on Thursday.
Have a
Okay.
good
Care.
one.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye-bye. Stop recording.